What happens when a man tries to humiliate his ex-wife at the most public event of the year? Richard Sterling thought he had it all, a younger woman on his arm, and his boring ex-wife, Rosie, firmly in the past. He paraded his new life at the glittering St. Regis Gala, expecting everyone to admire him. But he made one critical mistake. He never imagined the woman he cast aside would re-emerge from the ashes of their marriage, not as a victim, but as a phoenix. Get ready for a story of betrayal, revenge, and a transformation so stunning it stopped the entire city in its tracks. The Crystal Ballroom at the St. Regis was a galaxy of its own, a universe where money and power orbited each other in a dizzying, dazzling dance. Chandeliers like frozen waterfalls dripped light onto the city's elite. The air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and even more expensive ambitions hummed with the low murmur of conversations that could launch companies or end careers. Tonight was the annual Children's Foundation Gala, the undisputed apex of the social calendar, an event where being seen was as crucial as breathing. And no one understood that better than Richard Sterling. Richard, his silvering hair impeccably styled, his tuxedo tailored to within an inch of its life, surveyed the room with the proprietary air of a king examining his court. His hand rested possessively on the small of a much younger woman's back. This was Amber Collins, the press called her his companion. Richard preferred to think of her as his upgrade. With her fiery red dress clinging to a surgically perfected figure and her laughter loud and a little too bright, Amber was a living, breathing trophy. She was everything his ex-wife, Rosie, was not. "Isn't this divine?" Ricky Amber cooed, squeezing his arm as she spotted a congresswoman across the room. "Absolutely everyone is here." "They always are," Richard replied, his tone laced with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything. He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes scanning, assessing, cataloging. He was networking even in stillness. Every handshake was an investment, every smile a transaction. This gala wasn't just a party, it was a hunting ground. His gaze fell upon Jonathan Vance, a potential investor for his latest venture capital fund. "Excuse me for a moment, my dear," he murmured to Amber, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Work calls," Amber pouted prettily. "Don't be long, I feel so naked without you." Richard's answering smirk was thin. "You're never naked, darling, not with that necklace on." He gestured to the cascade of diamonds encircling her throat, a piece that had once been a Sterling family heirloom, one he'd pointedly asked Rosie to return during their acrimonious divorce. Seeing it on Amber was a small, private victory that still brought him a sliver of satisfaction. As he moved through the crowd, a human shark parting the waters, he couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. Life was good. Better than good. He had shed 15 years of a dull, predictable marriage and emerged leaner, sharper, reborn. Rosie, with her quiet intelligence, her classic but understated style, her preference for a library over a limelight. She had become an anchor. He was a thoroughbred, he reasoned, and he'd been shackled to a plough horse. He remembered their last argument before the final separation. He had called her plain. "You're just plain, Rosie." He'd said the words, slithering out with a casual cruelty he'd perfected over the years. "You have no spark, no ambition. Look at you. You're content to just be." He had expected tears of fight something. Instead, she had looked at him with a strange, clear-eyed serenity that he found unnerving. "You're right, Richard," she had said softly. "I am content to be. I'm just no longer content to be with you." The memory still pricked at him, not with guilt, but with irritation. It was her lack of a dramatic reaction that bothered him. It was as if she had already left him long before he had walked out the door. Their divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. He'd been generous, of course, or at least his lawyers had framed it that way. He gave her the suburban house, a comfortable alimony. What more could she want? She was almost 40, a ghost in the social world she had never truly embraced. Her life, he imagined, had shrunk, collapsing into a quiet beige existence of book clubs and gardening. The thought was vaguely comforting. "Richard, good to see you." Jonathan Vance greeted him with a hearty clap on the shoulder. Vance was old money, a man whose respect Richard craved. "Jonathan, you're looking well. The market must be agreeing with you." They exchanged the practiced pleasantries of their class, their conversation, a carefully choreographed dance of subtle boasts and probing questions. Richard was in his element. He was charming, witty, dropping the right names, laughing at the right jokes. Amber had rejoined him, clinging to his arm, playing her part as the beautiful, adoring accessory. "And this must be the lovely Amber," Vance said, his eyes giving her a quick, almost imperceptible once-over. "So lovely to finally meet you," Amber gushed. "I've heard so much about you. Ricky is always talking about your incredible business acumen." Richard cringed internally at the Ricky. It sounded so juvenile. Rosie had always called him Richard. "Well, you've certainly landed a good one," Vance said, turning back to Richard, a hint of something unreadable in his expression. "Though I must say, I was always very fond of Rosie. A class act, that woman. How is she doing?" The question was a landmine. Richard forced a nonchalant smile. "Rosie? Oh, she's fine, doing well. You know her, happy with the simple life." He made a vague gesture with his hand, as if describing a small, uninteresting creature. "I doubt this sort of thing is her scene anymore." "A shame," Vance said, his gaze drifting towards the grand entrance of the ballroom. "She had one of the sharpest minds I've ever encountered. Her insights on the board of the museum were invaluable." Richard felt a familiar flicker of resentment. People had always said that about Rosie. They'd praised her intelligence, her grace, her quiet dignity. He'd seen it as a reflection on him, a testament to his good taste. But over time, it had begun to feel like a competition he was losing. She had a light of her own, and he had wanted to be the only son in their universe. "Well, she's focused on other things now," he said dismissively, eager to change the subject. "Now about that new tech fund." But Vance wasn't listening. His attention, along with that of several others nearby, was fixed on the massive ornate doors of the ballroom. A hush was beginning to fall, a ripple of silence spreading outwards from the entrance as heads began to turn. Richard followed their gaze, annoyed at the interruption. The arrival of a latecomer, no matter how important, rarely caused this kind of stir. A politician maybe, a visiting royal, the crowd, near the entrance, parted slowly like the Red Sea, and through the gap, a figure emerged. For a moment, Richard's brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a woman. But that was too simple a word. She was a vision, a spectre of impossible elegance, gliding into the room. She wore a gown the color of midnight, a swath of deep blue silk that seemed to drink the light. It was cut with an audacious simplicity that screamed couture, clinging to curves he didn't know existed, and pooling at her feet like liquid shadow. A single breathtaking diamond necklace, far more spectacular than the one on Amber's neck, rested against her collarbone. Her hair, which she used to wear in a sensible shoulder-length cut, was swept up in a complex, yet effortless-looking chignon, revealing the graceful line of her neck. But it was her face that caused the air to leave Richard's lungs. The face was familiar, but the expression was not. The quiet, almost timid woman he had divorced was gone. In her place was a woman of supreme, unshakable confidence. Her makeup was subtle, yet transformative, emphasizing high cheekbones he'd forgotten she had, and eyes that now seemed to hold a universe of secrets. And she was smiling. Not the gentle, accommodating smile he remembered, but a small, knowing smile of a woman who knew her own worth. Amber, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, whispered, "Who is that? She looks like a movie star." Richard couldn't answer. He couldn't breathe. His champagne glass felt impossibly heavy in his suddenly nerveless hand. The room, with its hundreds of powerful guests, its cascading chandeliers, and its buzz of importance, seemed to fade into the background. There was only the woman in the midnight blue dress, because he knew who she was. As she took another step into the room, a collective gasp seemed to follow her. People were not just looking, they were staring. Whispers erupted, spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. "Is that, my God, it can't be, Rosie Sterling." And as his name echoed through the stunned silence, Richard Sterling felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. This wasn't the plain, simple ex-wife he had relegated to the suburbs of his memory. This was a stranger, a goddess, a reckoning. This was Rosie, and she had just walked back into his life. Rosie felt the weight of their stares like a physical touch, 1,000 invisible hands brushing against her skin. 6 months ago, it would have sent her scurrying for the nearest exit, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Tonight, she welcomed it. She absorbed it. It was fuel. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for weeks, playing it over and over again until the fear had been worn down into a smooth, hard stone of resolve in her gut. The walk from the car to the ballroom entrance had been the longest of her life. Her hands, encased in long silk gloves, had trembled slightly as she'd given her name at the check-in. The woman's eyes had widened in recognition, the first small tremor of the earthquake she was about to cause. Now, standing at the precipice of her old life, she paused, a deliberate, calculated hesitation. She let them look. She let them drink in the transformation. The Rosie they remembered was a woman who had perfected the art of being unobtrusive, of blending into the wallpaper of her own life. She had worn muted colors, sensible heels, and an expression of polite reserve. She had been Mrs. Richard Sterling, a role, not a person. The woman standing before them now was a masterpiece of defiance. The midnight blue gown, a custom creation by a daring young designer named Marco Valenti, was a statement. It was bold, elegant, and unapologetically sensual. The slit that ran up the side, invisible when she stood still, flashed a tantalizing glimpse of a toned leg as she moved. The diamond necklace, the starlight cascade, was on loan from a high-end jeweler, a friend of a friend. It wasn't a family heirloom passed down by a man. It was a temporary crown she had chosen for herself. Her transformation was more than just clothes and jewels. It was in her posture, the straightness of her spine, the confident set of her shoulders. It was in the tilt of her head, the calm, sweeping gaze with which she surveyed the room. The months since the divorce had been a period of intense, painful, and ultimately liberating reconstruction. She had hired a personal trainer not to please a man, but to feel strong in her own body. She had worked with a stylist not to fit in, but to discover what made her feel beautiful. She had spent hours in therapy, excavating the woman she had buried under 15 years of Richard's casual dismissals and subtle belittlements. She saw him then, across the sea of frozen faces. He was standing next to the redhead, the one she'd seen in paparazzi photos. The woman looked like a cheap imitation of the glamour Rosie was now effortlessly radiating. But it was Richard's face that she focused on. The slack-jawed shock, the flicker of disbelief warring with cold, hard fury in his eyes. It was more satisfying than she had dared to imagine. A slow smile touched Rosie's lips, a genuine one this time. She took her first step into the ballroom and the spell was broken. The whispers erupted into a roar. Rosie Sterling, I don't believe it. What has she done? She looks incredible. Richard must be choking on his champagne. The last comment came from Beatrice Fairfax, the city's foremost gossip columnist, her eyes gleaming with professional delight. This was not just a social event anymore. It was a story. Rosie glided through the crowd, a serene smile fixed on her face. People she had known for years approached her with a newfound deference. The women who had once pitied her now looked at her with a mixture of awe and envy. The men who had barely noticed her before were now stumbling over themselves to catch her eye. Rosie, darling, you look absolutely breathtaking, gushed a woman whose name escaped her. Thank you, Carol, Rosie, said her voice smooth and even. She had made a point to remember the names of those who had been kind to her and to pointedly forget those who had followed Richard's lead in dismissing her. She was making her way towards the bar when a man stepped into her path, blocking her way. He was tall, with a rugged, handsome face that stood out amongst the soft, pampered men of Richard's circle. He had dark, intelligent eyes that held a hint of amusement. I apologize for being so forward, he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. But I have to say, your entrance was the most compelling thing I have seen all year. My name is Julian Croft. Rosie recognized the name immediately. Julian Croft was a self-made man, a tech billionaire, who had a reputation for being brilliant, reclusive, and utterly uninterested in the city's social games. He rarely attended these events. Rosie Sterling, she replied, extending her gloved hand. He took it, his grip warm and firm. He didn't bow over it in the flamboyant European style some men affected. He just held it for a moment, his eyes never leaving hers. I know who you are, Mrs. Sterling. Or is it Ms. Sterling now, Ms. Sterling, she confirmed, a spark of pleasure running through her at the simple affirmation. And please call me Rosie. Rosie, he repeated as if testing the name. It suits you, far better than the whispers I've been hearing. And what whispers are those, Mr. Croft, that you were a ghost? It seems the reports of your demise were greatly exaggerated. His smile was warm and genuine, and for the first time that evening, Rosie felt herself truly relax. Across the room, Richard watched this exchange with a mounting sense of rage. Who the hell was that man talking to his Rosie? Not his anymore. A nasty little voice in his head reminded him, but the possessive instinct was deeply ingrained. He saw the way the man was looking at her, the way she was smiling at him. It was a kind of easy, intimate rapport that he and Rosie hadn't shared in years. Ricky, who is she talking to? Amber's voice was shrill, cutting through his red-misted haze. And why is everyone staring at her? It's just your frumpy ex-wife. She got a new dress, so what? Shut up, Amber. Richard snapped, his voice a low hiss. Amber recoiled, her eyes welling with tears. Don't you talk to me like that. But Richard was no longer paying attention to her. He was watching Rosie and Julian Croft. He watched as Julian laughed, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to draw Rosie in. He watched as Julian gestured to the bar and offered her his arm. And he watched as Rosie took it, her gloved fingers resting on his forearm as they walked away together, the center of their own universe in the middle of the crowded room. The sight was a physical blow. He had created this narrative in his head, a story where he was the victor, the one who had escaped a dull life for a brighter, more exciting one. Rosie was supposed to be the tragic figure, the forgotten wife, fading into obscurity. But the woman in the midnight blue dress was not tragic. She was triumphant. And her triumph, he realized with a sickening jolt, was his humiliation. "Richard, I can't believe it's her," Jonathan Vance said, reappearing at his side. He wasn't looking at Richard. His eyes were fixed on Rosie. "My God, she's magnificent." The word hung in the air between them, a judgment and a verdict. Magnificent. It was the last word in the world Richard Sterling wanted to hear used to describe the woman he had thrown away. The gala, which had begun as his victory lap, was rapidly turning into his personal hell, and the night he suspected was far from over. The conversation with Julian Croft was like a cool drink of water after a decade in the desert. He didn't talk about the past, didn't ask prying questions, didn't treat her like a spectacle. He talked about art, about a recent trip to Kyoto, about the ridiculousness of the canapes. He was funny, self-deprecating, and he listened, truly listened, when she spoke. "So what's your story, Rosie Sterling?" he asked as they found a quieter corner near the terrace away from the main crush. "And I don't mean the one everyone in this room is currently writing in their heads." Rosie took a sip of the champagne he'd procured for her. It tasted like victory. "I'm a woman who decided to read a different book," she said simply. Julian's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I like that. Most people here just keep rereading the same page." "So you're an editor? A publisher?" "No," she smiled. "Just a connoisseur of new chapters." The confidence felt foreign and exhilarating on her tongue. 6 months ago, she would have mumbled something about being a mother and a former board member. Tonight, she was the protagonist. Their easy laughter and palpable chemistry did not go unnoticed. Beatrice Fairfax was scribbling furiously in her notepad. Amber was shooting daggers from across the room, her face a mask of furious disbelief. But the most intense gaze came from Richard. He was watching them with a burning laser-like focus, his knuckles white as he gripped his glass. He couldn't stand it. He had to reassert control. He had to put her back in her box. Excusing himself from a now sniffling Amber, he strode across the ballroom, his path clearing before him as people sensed the impending confrontation. He reached Rosie and Julian just as Julian was recounting a disastrous sailing trip. "Rosie," Richard said, his voice tight. He pointedly ignored Julian, as if he were a piece of furniture. "I need to speak with you." Rosie turned to him slowly, her expression one of polite inquiry, as if addressing a stranger who'd asked for directions. "Richard, I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of a conversation." The dismissal, so cool and public, stunned him. "This will only take a moment. It's important." "I'm sure it is," she replied, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "But as you can see, I'm otherwise engaged." She then turned her back on him, a gesture so final and dismissive it was like a slap in the face. She smiled brightly at Julian. "You were saying something about a seagull, and your hat," Julian, to his credit, picked up the thread of his story without missing a beat, though his eyes danced with amusement. The message was clear. Richard Sterling had no power here. Humiliation burned in Richard's gut, hot and acidic. He was used to being the center of attention, the one who commanded respect. To be dismissed so casually by her in front of a man like Julian Croft, it was intolerable. He stood there for a moment, floundering, before retreating in a haze of fury. His retreat took him straight into the path of a furious Amber. "What was that?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "She just turned her back on you. Are you going to let her get away with that? And who is that man she's with?" "It doesn't matter who he is," Richard snarled, grabbing her arm a little too tightly. "It's a pathetic attempt to make me jealous. It's so transparent." Jealous? Amber laughed, a shrill, ugly sound. "She's making you look like a fool, Ricky. Everyone is talking about it. They're laughing at you. At us." The accusation hit a raw nerve. "Don't be ridiculous. No one is laughing at me." But as he looked around, he saw that she was right. The whispers hadn't died down. They had changed in tone. The shock had given way to amusement, to a schadenfreude that was palpable. He saw smirks on the faces of his rivals, pitying looks from his allies. He, Richard Sterling, the master of the universe, had become the butt of the joke at his own coronation. The root of it all, he knew, was Rosie. This entire fiasco was her fault. This calculated theatrical display was designed for one purpose: to humiliate him. He thought back to their marriage, to the countless times he had made her feel small, insignificant. He'd seen it as necessary a way of maintaining the natural order of things. He was the star. She was the supporting cast. He remembered a specific incident about 2 years before the divorce. He had been up for a major promotion, a seat on the executive board. The final decision was coming down to him and another colleague. The CEO, a man named George Hamid, had hosted a dinner party for the finalists. Rosie had been seated next to Hamid, and she had, in her quiet way, charmed him. They had discussed modern art, a passion of Hamid's that Richard had always found tedious. The next day, Hamid had called Richard. "Your wife is a remarkable woman, Richard," he'd said, "incredibly bright. Her insights on the new acquisitions for the gallery were fascinating. You're a lucky man." Richard had gotten the promotion, but the praise for Rosie had soured the victory. It felt as though he had won on her coattails. That night, he had been cruel to her. Don't think that little performance last night meant anything, he'd sneered. Hamid was just being polite. "Stick to what you're good at, planning menus and looking pretty. Leave the thinking to me." She had flinched, her eyes clouding with a hurt that he had at the time found strangely satisfying. It had put her back in her place. Now, seeing her across the room, radiating a confidence that seemed to eclipse the light from the chandeliers, he realized how wrong he had been. He hadn't been putting her in her place. He had been trying to extinguish her light because he was afraid it would outshine his own. His simmering rage needed an outlet, and Amber was the closest target. "This is your fault," he seethed, turning on her. "That ridiculous dress. You look like a Christmas ornament." "My fault," Amber shrieked, her voice attracting more unwanted attention. "You're the one whose ex-wife just showed up looking like a goddess, and you're blaming my dress." She gestured wildly towards Rosie. "Go do something. Don't just stand here and let her win." "It's not a competition," he insisted, even as he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it was. And he was losing. Meanwhile, Rosie was learning things. Julian Croft, it turned out, was on the board of the Children's Foundation. He was a major donor, but he usually sent a proxy to the gala. "What made you decide to come in person this year?" Rosie asked. Julian's gaze was direct. "I heard a rumor that the foundation was about to get a new, very dynamic board member. I was curious to meet her." He paused, a smile playing on his lips. "I believe her name is Rosie Sterling." Rosie's carefully constructed composure almost slipped. "You knew I may have had a hand in your nomination," he admitted. "I was on the committee. When your name came up, I remembered Jonathan Vance mentioning you. I did a little research." A woman who helped turn the City Museum's finances around with her fundraising strategies, who speaks 3 languages, and who has a degree in art history from the Sorbonne. You weren't just qualified, Rosie. You were a secret weapon they didn't even know they had. The validation was so profound, so unexpected, that Rosie felt a prickle of tears behind her eyes. She blinked them away fiercely. She would not cry. Not tonight. Richard never mentioned my work with the museum, she said softly, more to herself than to him. I'm beginning to suspect, Julian said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, that there's a great deal about you that Richard Sterling never appreciated. The warmth in his eyes was a balm on a wound she hadn't realized was still so raw. It was in that moment that she knew her transformation was complete. It wasn't about the dress or the necklace or the stairs. It was about this being seen, truly seen, for who she was. The evening was just getting started. The main event, the charity auction, was about to begin, and Rosie had a feeling that the real bidding had yet to commence. The charity auction was the centerpiece of the gala, a high-stakes performance where fortunes were flaunted and egos were put on the line, all under the guise of philanthropy. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a slick smile, took the stage, and a hush fell over the room. Richard, who had always dominated these events with his aggressive, almost brutalist bidding style, felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was his arena. He could reclaim his power here. The first few items, a week in a Tuscan villa, a set of vintage wines, went for predictable astronomical sums. Richard made a point of winning a particularly coveted item, a private dinner with a celebrity chef, bidding far more than it was worth just to show he could. He shot a triumphant look towards Rosie, but she wasn't even watching him. She was in a quiet, intense conversation with Julian Croft, both of them occasionally glancing at the auction catalogue. Then the final premier item was announced. It was a stunning abstract painting by a celebrated contemporary artist, piece that had been the talk of the art world. We'll start the bidding for Phoenix Rising at $100,000, the auctioneer announced. A paddle went up immediately. Julian Croft's. $200,000, he said, his voice calm and clear. Richard's head snapped towards him. He hadn't expected Croft to be interested. Richard saw himself as a patron of the arts. Croft was a tech guy, all circuits and code. Another bidder raised the price, then another. The bidding quickly climbed, a rapid-fire exchange between a handful of the city's wealthiest collectors. Richard stayed silent, watching, waiting for his moment to strike. He would let them tire themselves out, then sweep in at the end and take the prize. It was his signature move. The bidding reached $450,000, and the room grew quiet. It seemed to be stalled between two determined bidders. $450 going once, the auctioneer began. Richard raised his paddle. $500,000, he declared, his voice booming through the ballroom. A ripple of appreciation went through the crowd. This was the Richard Sterling they knew. One of the other bidders dropped out. The other hesitated, then shook his head. $500,000 going once, going twice. The auctioneer looked at Julian, who had not made a move since his initial bid. Julian simply smiled and gave a slight shake of his head. Victory surged through Richard. He had won. He had proven his dominance. He glanced at Rosie, a smug, victorious smile on his face. And then a new paddle went up, a paddle held by a hand in a long, midnight blue glove. $600,000, Rosie said, her voice not loud, but carrying an authority that cut through the silence like a diamond. The entire room seemed to suck in, a collective breath. All eyes swiveled from Richard to Rosie and back again. This was no longer an auction. It was a duel. Richard was thunderstruck. What was she doing? She couldn't afford this. Her alimony was generous, but it wasn't buy a major work of art at a whim generous. This was a stunt, a bluff. She was trying to drive up the price to make him pay more. Rage, pure and undiluted, flooded him. He would not be played. He raised his paddle again, his hand shaking slightly. 700,000. Rosie didn't even blink. 800,000. Amber was tugging at his sleeve, her eyes wide with panic. "Ricky, stop! What are you doing?" she whispered frantically. "It's just a painting." He shook her off. It was never just a painting. It was about pride, about power, about putting Rosie back in the place he had assigned her. $1 million, Richard snarled, throwing the number down like a gauntlet. The room erupted in gasps. $1 million for a painting at a charity auction was almost unheard of. It was a reckless, ego-driven move, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop himself. He stared at Rosie, daring her to continue. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but something else he couldn't read. She looked at Julian, who gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. She lowered her paddle. "The gentleman has made his point," she said, her voice laced with a cool amusement that was more infuriating than any anger. She turned to Julian. "It seems he wanted it more than I did." Richard had won. He had the painting. But as the auctioneer slammed the gavel down and announced him the winner, the victory felt hollow metallic in his mouth. He had just spent $1 million on a painting he didn't even particularly like, all to win a battle she had started. The applause felt thin, mocking. He had shown his strength, but he had also shown his weakness. He had shown the entire world how much his ex-wife could still get under his skin. Later, as people were mingling before the final speeches, Richard cornered her near the terrace. The fury he had been simmering all night was ready to boil over. "What in the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. "That was a childish, pathetic game, Rosie. You knew you couldn't afford that painting. You did it just to make me look like a fool." Rosie looked at him, and for the first time he saw a hint of the fire that had been banked for so long. "You're wrong, Richard," she said, her voice cold as ice. "I wasn't trying to make you look like a fool. You do a perfectly adequate job of that all by yourself. I was just revealing your character to the room." "My character," he scoffed. Yes, a man so insecure he'd rather spend $1 million than be seen losing to his ex-wife. A man so obsessed with control he can't stand to see me breathe the same air as him without trying to assert his dominance. She took a step closer, and he was taken aback by the intensity of her gaze. "You didn't see me as a wife, Richard. You saw me as a possession, and you can't stand the fact that your possession has learned to walk away." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing his pride, his ego, his carefully constructed self-image. "And as for affording it," she continued, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips, "you seem to have forgotten about the inheritance my grandmother left me. The one I never touched, because you told me we didn't need it, that you would provide for us. It seems my plain little life had a few secrets you weren't privy to." She paused, letting the information sink in. "Oh, and by the way, the artist Jean-Paul Dubois, he's an old friend from my time at the Sorbonne. He donated the painting on the condition that I be the one to present it. The bidding war was just a little performance art. All proceeds go to the children, of course. Your $1 million will do a lot of good." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He had been played, masterfully, utterly. He wasn't the victor. He was the mark. She hadn't been bidding against him for the painting. She had been using him to raise the price for a cause she championed with a painting donated by her friend. You, he stammered, speechless, with rage and humiliation. Me, she said softly. She looked past him, her eyes finding Julian, who was watching them from a distance, with a look of profound admiration. Now, if you'll excuse me, the Foundation's new board member has a speech to give. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his million-dollar victory feeling like a jester's cap on his head. He was Richard Sterling. He never lost. But as he watched Rosie take the stage to a round of thunderous applause, he knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the diamond on her neck that he had just lost something far more valuable than money. He had lost the war. The stage lights seemed to possess a consciousness of their own, seeking out Rosie and bathing her in a warm, impossibly golden glow. In their spotlight, the midnight blue of her dress deepened into the color of a fathomless ocean, and the starlight cascade at her throat fractured the light into 1,000 tiny, brilliant rainbows that danced across her skin. She didn't just look regal, she looked anointed. Serene, powerful, and utterly in command, she was the still point in the turning world of the crystal ballroom. The applause that greeted her was not the polite obligatory clapping for a donor's speech. It was a roar, a wave of genuine electric enthusiasm from a room that knew it was witnessing something seismic. It was the sound of a verdict being rendered. Richard stood frozen amidst the glittering throng, a ghost at a feast he had meticulously planned for himself. The champagne in his glass had gone warm, its bubbles dead. Amber, a splash of garish red in his peripheral vision, had long since detached herself from his side. He watched her melt into a clique of women who were now shooting him glances that were a poisonous cocktail of pity and morbid curiosity. He was an island, a rapidly eroding one, and the tide of public opinion was rushing out, leaving the jagged, ugly bedrock of his folly exposed for all to see. He had never felt so alone, in a room so full of people he knew. "Good evening," Rosie began. Her voice, amplified by the microphone, lost none of its intimate warmth. It resonated through the vast ballroom, a calm, clear tone that effortlessly commanded the attention of everyone present. "For 15 years, I attended this gala on the arm of a powerful man. I wore beautiful dresses, I smiled at the right people, and I wrote checks. I believed that was the scope of my ability to contribute. I was a passenger in my own life." Her eyes, calm and deliberate, swept the room, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, they met Richard's. There was no malice in her gaze, no gloating triumph he could have armed himself against. There was only a kind of sad, piercing clarity, the look of someone seeing him for exactly what he was and finding him wanting. It was a look that stripped him bare. "It's easy to become a passenger," she continued, her voice drawing them in. "In fact, it's the most comfortable thing in the world. It's safe. You let someone else do the driving, hold the map, choose the destination. You forget the power of your own 2 feet, the strength in your own voice. You forget you even have a choice, but then, one day, the car stops. You find yourself standing on the side of the road, alone, with the dust settling around you. And in that silence, you have a choice. You can wait for another car to come along and hope it's going your way, or you can start walking." A murmur of profound understanding rippled through the audience. This was a language that transcended wealth and status. It spoke to the woman whose husband made all the decisions, the man whose career was dictated by his father, the artist who had given up their dreams for a steady paycheck. Every person in that room, in some corner of their heart, understood the metaphor of the abandoned passenger. "I started walking," Rosie said, a new strength infusing her words. "And I discovered something wonderful. I discovered that my own 2 feet were stronger than I ever imagined, that my own voice, once I chose to use it, could speak volumes. I discovered that the destination I chose for myself was far more beautiful, more vibrant, more real than any place I had ever been driven to." And most importantly, her gaze shifted then, effortlessly finding Julian Croft in the crowd. He was leaning against a marble pillar, his arms crossed, a look of profound respect and admiration on his face. He gave her a small, encouraging smile that was just for her. "I discovered that I wasn't walking alone. Tonight, this foundation, which is so dear to my heart, has raised a record-breaking amount of money," she announced, her voice swelling with a pride that was infectious. "And it's thanks, in no small part, to the extraordinary if somewhat spirited but generosity of Mr. Richard Sterling." A wave of laughter, light, genuine and cathartic, filled the room. It wasn't entirely mocking. It was too appreciative for that. It was the laughter of people who had witnessed a master storyteller deliver the perfect, satisfying punchline. Richard felt his face burn, with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She was thanking him, but it was the most devastating, elegant condemnation he had ever received. With a few perfectly chosen words, she had framed his ego-driven folly not as a moment of weakness, but as a calculated act of philanthropy she had orchestrated. She was using the rubble of his pride as the foundation for her triumph. His $1 million contribution for Phoenix Rising, a rather aptly named piece, I think, she added with the faintest hint of a smile, will allow us to break ground on a project we have been dreaming of for years. It will fully fund the construction of a new state-of-the-art wing for the Children's Hospital. The applause was thunderous now, a testament to the scale of the donation. Richard felt a wave of nausea, so intense he had to grip the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. His name, his money, his act of public dominance, all of it had been hijacked. And so, Rosie concluded, her voice ringing with finality, "I am thrilled and deeply honored to announce that the new wing will be named the Sterling Wing. Checkmate." It was a move so brilliant, so complete in its strategic cruelty, that a part of him could only stand in stunned admiration. He felt the gazes of hundreds of people on him, expecting him to look pleased, proud. He was trapped. His name would now be forever attached to a building that would stand as a permanent brick-and-mortar monument to his public humiliation at her hands. She hadn't just defeated him, she had erased his narrative, co-opting his very name, the symbol of his power, and making it a symbol of her victory and his folly. She finished her speech with an eloquent and moving plea for continued support, but Richard heard none of it. He was lost in the roaring silence of his own defeat. When she was done, the room rose as one to its feet in a thunderous, sustained, standing ovation. It wasn't for Mrs. Richard Sterling, the quiet, decorative wife. It was for Rosie Sterling, the Phoenix, who had not only risen from the ashes, but had used the fire that was meant to consume her to forge herself anew. As she stepped down from the stage, she was immediately enveloped by a crowd of well-wishers. Jonathan Vance was one of the first to reach her, his face beaming. "Rosie," he said, taking both her hands in his. "That was masterful, simply masterful. Your mother always said you had a steel spine. She would have been so incredibly proud tonight." Julian was waiting for her at the edge of the adoring crowd. He didn't need to push his way through. He simply waited, a calm, steady presence. When she finally broke free, he didn't say anything. He just offered her his arm, a silent gesture of partnership that was more potent than any words of praise. She took it without hesitation, and together they walked towards the grand doors of the terrace, away from the noise and the lights into the cool, quiet promise of the night air. Richard finally moved his limbs, feeling heavy, disconnected. He walked almost in a trance out of the ballroom. He didn't bother to look for Amber. He knew what he would find: cold calculation. The trophy had seen the champion fall, and her loyalty, always a transactional commodity, was dissolving with his perceived power. Theirs was a contract, and he had just irrevocably breached its primary clause: invincibility. He stepped outside into the valet area. The crisp night air was a shock, slicing through the overheated fog of the ballroom and his own private hell. And then he saw them. Rosie and Julian were standing by a sleek black car, its engine purring softly. Julian was holding the door for her, his posture one of easy, confident grace. Before she got in, she turned as if she sensed his presence across the expanse of polished concrete and luxury cars. Her eyes met his. In that moment, he searched her face for any sign of the old battles: anger, hatred, resentment, even a flicker of smug satisfaction. He found none of it. He saw something far more devastating: a serene, settled indifference. It was the look of a person for whom he was no longer a major character, not even a villain. He had been demoted to a footnote in a story that was no longer about him. The story of Richard and Rosie was over. This was the first page of the story of Rosie. She gave him a final small nod. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, nor of truce. It was a gesture of dismissal. Final, absolute, and complete. Then she slid into the car, a queen, leaving a conquered battlefield. Her victory, not just absolute, but effortless. As the car pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the glittering, indifferent labyrinth of the city, Richard Sterling finally understood everything. He hadn't just lost a wife. He hadn't just lost $1 million. He had lost the best part of himself, the part he had never bothered to know. He had traded a rare, flawless diamond for a piece of shining glass, and he hadn't even realized his own poverty until he saw the diamond shining in someone else's light. He was left alone in the dark, with the hollow echo of applause for a triumph that was not his, and the bitter, metallic taste of $1 million mistake. The king was alone in his gilded cage, and for the first time, with a clarity that shattered him, he realized the door had been open all along. He had just been too blind, too arrogant, too in love with the reflection in the bars to ever think of walking out. And that's how a woman who was cast aside as plain and boring showed an entire city that the most dazzling transformations don't come from a new dress or a new man, but from the quiet, unshakable discovery of your own worth. Rosie Sterling's story isn't just about revenge. It's about reclamation. It's about taking back the pen and writing your own story in your own words, on your own terms. She didn't just win the night, she won back her life, and in doing so, created a legend. What did you think of Rosie's epic comeback? Was Richard a villain, or just a fool who threw away his greatest treasure? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of empowerment, intricate drama, and the sweetest, most satisfying karma, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own power, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will have you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss what we have in store for you next.